The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
We are back, in case you're wondering, with George Case. George, we have a hell of a panel for you today. We have Ron Rabinovitz. How you doing, Ron?
Hi, Ralph. How are you?
Al Blumkin is here.
Hi, everybody.
Dave Hubler is on assignment. I'm here, Ralph Tyko from the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, as I said. And, Ronnie, you brought a guest. And
I did.
He's got a very, very famous name. And he's famous in his own right. And I can't wait to talk to him. Ronnie, would you introduce your guest, please?
I'd be happy to. Mike Veeck has been called the funniest man in baseball. He, along with comedian Bill Murray, started the independent league, St. Paul Saints, in 1993. And today he's part owner of several independent teams, prominently the Saints and the Charleston, South Carolina River Dogs. And they've been going strong for 25 years. They have the most gorgeous downtown stadium in St. Paul, the $63 million new stadium, and it's fantastic, and they're drawing like crazy. Mike Veeck, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all for having me.
Great.
Yeah, it's great. George, you're the man. It's your show. Would you start off by asking Mike Veeck anything that comes to your mind?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say I'm really pleased to be able to talk to Mike. My dad, played for Mike's father, Bill Veeck, in 1946 with Cleveland. And I think that was probably before Mike was even born. And, I have photos of my dad with Bill and, his nickname, Sports Shirt Bill. And I'm sure that all of Mike's successes and his promotions and everything that he's accomplished over the years, he can attribute an awful lot of it to his dad, who was really a promotional genius when it comes to baseball.
Well, that's very kind, George. Thank you on his behalf. I think, those halcyon days in Cleveland were some of my dad's, favorite. And in this business, you're really not allowed to have favorites. I've worked for 4 major league teams, not successfully certainly for 2 of them, and had some fun with the other 2. But for a Chicago guy to admit that Cleveland really was the one was really, really tough for my old man. And it gave me an idea how magical that ball club was, and the city was just on fire, with Satchel Paige and a pitching staff, second to none. But the thing that was most memorable as far as I was concerned was the fact that my old man signed Larry Doby 7 weeks after Jack Robinson, of course, had been signed by Branch Rickey. And watching the combination of bittersweet and poignancy and the difficulties that Mr. Doby endured, if you will, while being witnessed by 3.5 million. And, of course, the record books attribute 2.6 million people to the 48 Indians championship team. But the truth is that my old man didn't want to pay the quarter luxury tax, so he let 750,000 women and children in free. So
that sounds like him. That's great. I wanted to mention one thing, Mike, as you're talking about that 48 team. My dad played with the Indians in 46, and that was the year that your dad took over as the owner of Cleveland. And a lot of those same players were there in 48. Bob Feller, Bob Lemon, and, Jim Higgin. And, those guys were, and Kenny Keltner, those guys, that was a nucleus of a terrific ball club in 46. They didn't have a good year. And then, as you mentioned, your dad signed Larry Doby in 47, and the fact is that Doby, turned out to be a tremendous player, a future Hall of Famer, just like your dad. And, your father really, as far as I'm concerned, he broke the color line not only with Larry Doby, but I have a photograph, and a lot of people have talked to me about it. Your father arranged a race between Jesse Owens and my father at Cleveland Stadium in August of '46. And this was, Jesse was, as everyone knows, was a world-class sprinter, known as the fastest man in the world for his 4 gold medals at Munich. Jesse originally was going to race my dad in his tracksuit. My dad was going to be in his Cleveland uniform, and then they decided, no, that's not really fair. So your dad had a special Cincinnati Reds uniform made for Jesse Owens, and I have the photographs of the finish of that race where Jesse is beating my dad by about a half a step at the finish line, and people have written to me and said, we didn't know Jesse Owens played baseball, and I said, no, he didn't. But I said that was a special uniform made for him, and it had Cincinnati on it because, Jesse graduated from Ohio State, and back then Cleveland was the American League team, Cincinnati was the National League team, Columbus, Ohio, where Ohio State is located, right in the middle of the state. So it made sense to promote that race in Cleveland with 2 Ohio people, my dad playing for the Indians and Jesse, representing Cincinnati. So that race, Mike, was something that I remember my dad telling me the story. He said, Bill came to me and said, George, I've got an idea. I think I want to promote a race between you and Jesse Owens to see who's the fastest. And I know my dad said to your father, he said, Bill, you got to be kidding. Jesse's the fastest in the world. And your father said to my dad, he said, George, I think you're going to do pretty well. And I'm going to pay you X amount of dollars. I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to pay Jesse, but I think, the race is going to be a good one. And according to what my father told me that, and your dad, that was really probably his first promotion, taken over as the owner of the Indians. They drew an extra 20,000 or so to Cleveland Stadium for, a game which meant nothing against the St. Louis Browns. And a team that your dad, would later,
please don't mention
before that rather. I mean, he had the St. Louis Browns, in the 50s, and the fact is that he was responsible for that team, and then moving them to Baltimore, and then taking over as the White Sox. And I go back a long way because of my father listening to a lot of the stories about your dad, and I'm just really pleased to be able to talk to you.
Well, thank you. I find that interesting about the race. The thing that you said was, I think you're going to do pretty well. And that was my dad. One of the things that when you stand for the kind of things, the joy of the human spirit, that was really his greatest gift. I mean, he just loved people. But he was a pretty good judge of talent, and that's kind of lost, with the Brownie and the then midget, now vertically challenged Eddie Goodell. But underneath there really was the heart of a purist, a real baseball guy who just understood that he never preached. It was almost by osmosis he would teach. But the one thing he would say to me is, Miguel, people who love baseball, they were 35% of your audience when my dad was running it, meaning my grandfather, and Dad would say it's 35% now, and it'll be 35%. And that leaves 65% of the audience to be won over to this great game. And, I've never forgotten that. You can count on 35% of the people who just hate the things I do, hated the things, that Dad did. But 65% of the people come to test and see if they want to become a baseball fan, and that's just that's low-lying fruit as long as Veecks are, as far as we're concerned. And those were the people we wanted to lure in by hook or crook to expose them to this great game, the greatest game in the world as far as I'm concerned.
Well, Mike, what you're talking about, I absolutely understand. And the fact is that, your dad was so fan friendly. I mean, he knew, and just like I mean, you've built a tremendous thing with the Saints in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And the fact is that you have grown up in baseball. I grew up in baseball, and you trace your roots back to your grandfather. I trace my roots back to my father. And the fact is that we've both been around baseball forever. And what you're talking about, so many people, I think, lose sight. It's become such a money business in the major leagues. They lose sight of the fans. And to me, as your dad, recognized at a very early age because of his background and your background that you recognized from your father, the fans are what's important. They're the ones who are paying the bills. They're the ones, and if you can get them in the ballpark and get them to, really enjoy themselves and have a wonderful experience, I think it's great. And you're to be congratulated on your efforts. And, I'm really pleased the success that you've had, because I think it's a wonderful, attribute that you picked up from your dad and from your grandfather, being in baseball all of your life.
It was always about the fans. And I can tell you unequivocally that my old man never made a decision that wasn't for the best of his guests. And, and talking about, I'm going to tell you guys a story I've never told publicly, because it's such a sweet story. And you mentioned money, and this gives you an idea of how the world, regrettably, not for the better, I don't think, has changed. And that was after the 48 championship. They made a lot of money. I mean, that was a very successful club, but the best trade my old man never made. He spent all winter trying to unload Boudreaux, and all he does is manage him to a championship and MVP. But after the championship game, my old man signed 25 contracts, and he left them on his desk. And the players walked in, and they were expected to fill out the amount. And Kenny Keltner, who had an off year that year in 48, gave himself I'm not going to discuss the number, but gave himself a sizable decrease. And my old man said, Kenny, what are you thinking about? We had the greatest year in the history of the game in terms of attendance, a record that wasn't broken for another 40 years in Cleveland. I allow no Cleveland jokes. And Kenny wept. Kenny said, I didn't contribute. And my old man said, that's just not, and changed the contract. But imagine leaving 25 contracts on your desk today. You'd have 25 partners.
You know what? Hey, Mike, you're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. And as you're talking about, and I have to laugh because I've mentioned this so many times, I mean, the players back then, they signed 1-year contracts. That was the deal. There was no, there was no long-term deals. There was no signing bonuses. There was none of that stuff. You went in and negotiated. The player went in and negotiated with either with the owner, as in your case with your dad, or with the general manager. But there were no agents involved. And there were players. There was a story about Ted Williams. He had an off year 1 year, and he told Tom Yawkey that he was going to take a decrease in his salary because he didn't feel that he contributed what he should normally have contributed. Well, today, it's a totally different world. I mean, a guy can have an off year, but he might have 10 more years left on his contract for multi-million dollars or whatever it is, and that's the way it is. Unfortunately, it's a different world today.
Yeah, when I was with Tampa, when they were still the Devil Rays, around the new millennium, as we used to like to say, we had a general manager who had a contract that ran, I don't know, my son won't be alive when it finally runs out. My old man used to say, look, if it's good enough for Walter Alston to have a contract every year, it's good enough for the rest of these guys.
Right. Well, that's a great way to put it because, as all of us know, I mean, Walter Alston in his, 20-some years with the Dodgers, I mean, he signed a 1-year contract every year. And that's the way it was done. When my dad was playing and all those great players, I mean, they signed for the 1 year. You had a good year, the team had a good year at the gate, you get a raise. If you had a good year but the team did not have a good year at the gate, you probably are going to sign for the same amount of money. And the fact is that the players sometimes they would hold out, I remember one time my dad was holding out for $500. And Clark Griffith finally said to him, he said, George, I'm going to sign your contract. He said, we'll agree to those terms, but if we don't make it up at the gate at the end of the year, I want my money back.
So gate income is basically all they had back then. Yeah, TV was still in its infancy. There was almost no merchandising, and the gate was basically the only revenue stream that they had.
Well, Alan, you're right about that. And Mike will attest to that too, because there was none of that. The fan shops, and if you look at a perfect example of that, you look at some old photographs of stands and people in the stands watching a ball game. They're in jacket and tie, or the women are in dresses. I mean, you look at a game today, and you'll see the fans. They're in T-shirts, they're in jackets, they're in hats, they're in all this stuff. That's all part of the revenue stream that's coming into baseball. And it's a different way to go to market, and the players and the owners did have to depend upon the gate receipts, no question. Back then, that's what it was. And if you could, draw 1 million, 2 million, 2.5 million, whatever fans, that's what you were aiming for, because that was your revenue stream for the ball club.
Yeah, Mike Veeck, my name is Alan Blumkin. I just want to let you know I became an admirer of your dad. When I read Veckers and Rec 40-odd years ago.
Ed Lynn.
And I read also the book that he came out with later, the book about where he discusses the Black Sox and Hustler's Handbook.
Right.
And one thing I want to know,
I thought it was the better book.
You're operating a team in St. Paul, Minnesota, right?
Yes.
Are they more popular than the Twins?
We have our moments.
They have the most gorgeous stadium. Mike has built the most beautiful stadium. I would say it's probably one of the finest in the minor league system. Absolutely fabulous.
Fortunate. I mean, they've come from all over the world. Julie Snow, it's an overused word, but Julie Snow from Snow Krylik designed that ballpark. Nobody liked it. None of my partners liked it except Bill Murray, and everybody else was like, I don't really know. But it was a radical departure from anything. It actually went down 35 feet and used the old Gillette building as a foundation. But it was inspired, obviously, by her mentor, had been inspired by the great architecture out of Oak Park in Chicago, and she kept saying, we're going to turn the building inside out. We're going to take steel and glass and wood and design this. And all I can say is that Julie Snow has won an A1A award, one of only 3 in the world awarded to stadiums. And it's won every architectural award that is possible to win. And she just had this tremendous vision. And the day I called her up, I'll never forget, she goes, you know what I do? And I said, yeah, you designed the Russian Museum. And she goes, I don't know anything about ballparks. I said, that's why we want you. We'll get a baseball architect, to work on dimensions and the field and drainage and things like that. But we really want someone like you with no preconceived notions. And she said, you're nuts. And I said, you're not really the first one to tell me that. That goes back to my mom. And so I've lost track of the number of awards, and they've come from all over the world, from Japan and New Zealand, to look at this Frank Lloyd Wright inspired planes, angles. It's really a thing of beauty. I just can't say enough about it.
Magnificent. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask Mike, I'd like to ask you one thing about that stadium. Now, I understand, you're trying to be very, green, eco-friendly there. I think the water is recycled or something. And I was just curious, how long was that stadium from the planning for your inception to when you're ready to open the doors? How long a process was that?
I spent 5 miserable years at the State House lobbying. We put the first $15 million in the Saints, and the city put in the equivalent $15 million in infrastructure. But that was basically a 2-year build out, but 6.5 years in the planning stages. And what happened was really simple. I was very happy out at Midway. And I had no intention of leaving until my wife and I went to a Billy Joel concert at the XL Energy Center. And it had just recently opened. And she said, "Time me." And, she's been my partner all these 30 years, and we've, had some successes and had, probably more failures. But she buys a beer, goes to the restroom, she's back in her seat in 5 minutes, and she goes, "You better do something about your ballpark because the efficiency here is going to eat us alive." And she was right. People think, you got to have it for more revenue. Minnesotans don't realize that ESPN says that Target Field is the best fan experience and viewing ballpark in the country. And number 3 is the XL Energy Center. They threw Lambeau Field in just to annoy Minnesotans, but imagine being 7 miles from these facilities, and so for survival, we had to lobby. And that's how we ended up with a new ballpark.
It's fabulous, too. Absolutely fabulous.
Now, Mike, let me ask you one other thing about that. Now, how did you hook up with Bill Murray? I mean, where did that all come from? Because obviously, he's so well recognized as a comedian, but, I didn't realize until I did a little research about, how much of a baseball fan he is. But how did you meet him, or how did you get together when you first, started to build this relationship?
Well, he was having some success. We were obviously both guys. And after I blew up those disco records in Chicago, I left town, shall we say, with a small sense of urgency. And
that was a famous promotion, absolutely.
Yeah, and it worked out well for almost everyone involved. We forfeited only the 4th game in history, and I watched my career explode on the very top of those record albums. So I beat a hasty retreat down to Fort Lauderdale and open an ad agency. And so that was in 1979. And in 1989, 10 years later, I realized I'd been blackballed. I couldn't get a job. Veeck is not a great name to have if you want a front office job. And even the work that I felt we'd done for, 5 years with the White Sox that I, included suites and picnic areas and caring about fans and things like that, I just couldn't get a job. And Murray calls me up one day and he says, "Are you done pouting?" And I said, "Actually, Bill, that was really funny, but this was not a self-imposed exile. I'm not Bonaparte sitting on the island waiting." And he goes, "We just bought the Miami Miracle." And I said, "Yeah, I heard something about that. And if you're going to hustle me, I got some demands." And he said, "What do you mean demands? You can't even ask for a salary, the position you're in." I said, "You're right. I'll take whatever you're offering me." And they hired me after they bought the Miracle. We moved the club to Pompano. Then we moved 2 years later over to Fort Myers, where MacPhail and I worked out a very tenuous, shall we say, agreement. And for 20 years, the Saints ownership also owned the Fort Myers Miracle and ran the Twin Spring Training, which added to the incestuousness of the relationship. But Bill hired me when nobody else would, and I'll never forget that. I will never forget that. A few years later, we became partners. I told him I wanted to come to St. Paul, start an independent team. And, a lot of people, I called a lot of my old friends with the White Sox, and they said, independent baseball will never work. And I said, we're going to give it a shot, and it took off. Who'd have thunk it?
Yeah.
Mike, let me ask you this. I don't mean to keep asking you questions. I know some of the other guys want to jump in there too, but I'm just curious about independent baseball. how do those other teams that you play against, how do they draw? I mean, you obviously have done very well, but where I live in the Philadelphia area, we don't really have an independent team. They had one, I think, over in Camden, New Jersey. But I'm just curious as to how in the Midwest, independent baseball is doing overall. Attendance-wise, and where you're getting your players, and how the success rate, if it's parallels what you're doing, or if you're sort of like the blip and the other ones are struggling. I'm just curious.
No, we got a couple in Texas that are struggling because when you're successful, people come in and think, oh, this is easy and we'll make some money, and of course. We came in with the idea that we would do everything we could for the fans. We would keep prices low, and we use the same networks for players that we use in Charleston, for example, where I'm affiliated with the Yankees, the hated Yankees, I might add. It's kind of ironic. My old man, thank God we cremated him, because if I buried him, he'd be flipping over, and he wouldn't rest easy. But so we use the same network of scouts for independent baseball. The Winnipeg franchise, the Kansas City franchise, they're averaging 4,000-5,000 people. It's a very healthy league, the American Association. Originally, the Northern League, we started with 6. And so, there were then like 10 independent leagues. But right now there are 4 or 5 that are really healthy, simply because Major League Baseball has accepted us as part of the food chain. I mean, we've had just in St. Paul, for example, 145 players over the 26 years have gone back to major league organizations, and 20 players have gone back to the big leagues. And so you multiply that out, and, it's part of the player development. Now, the beauty of it is I don't have to listen to the incessant harangues from the commissioner's office about why you can't do things. And so it's an experimental league. We really made our bones when Jack Morris pitched for us. Jack recently of the Hall of Fame, he pitched for the 96 Twins, and for the 96 Saints. And I had Darryl Strawberry that year, who hit 18 home runs in 29 games. And we sold him to the Yankees. Independent ball's here to stay. Kevin Millar was our poster boy. He was undrafted out of Lamar University, and Dirty Al Gallagher called and said, "Look, I got a guy with no tools." I said, "Hey, I was that kind of player. I don't want anybody like me." And he goes, "Wait a minute, Jack." He said, "The guy's got no tools. All he does is beat you. He gets dirty Al Gallagher, even if he's not." Dirty Al Gallagher called, and
Dirty, he was a San Francisco Giants, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, he played with Charlie Fox, the year of the Fox, did Gallagher. And
yeah, I know he was
just as you describe him, a gutsy overachiever. That's basically Al Gallagher.
He knew, Al Gallagher knows. I could just go. Danny Gladden and I have this conversation about it because he played for him for a year somewhere in his somewhat checkered career, and Al called and said, "Kevin Millar can play." Well, Kevin Millar made 3 errors his first day in St. Paul, and I called Dirty Al and he wouldn't come to the phone. And he goes, "You're not as patient as your father." I said, "My father's dead. You got plenty of time to be patient when you're dead." And I said, "This guy just booted 3 balls." He goes, "Just bear with him. This kid can play." And we sold him to the Marlins. He got a World Series ring. He got a World Series ring with the Red Sox. And that really put independent baseball, because from 93, from the first year the Saints were, 5 of those guys went to the big leagues. That's a remarkable 5 Saints players from this beer league, as Royce used to describe it, went to the major league. I'm really proud of that. I mean, I never talk about the caliber of baseball, because if you were going to see the greatest baseball in the world, you got to go to Target Field and see the Twins. I get that. But if you want to see great minor league baseball and not mortgage your house to enjoy an afternoon or an evening with your family, then we're your guys. That's the way it works.
And it's so much fun. I mean, you guys make it so much fun. It's just all the things you do between innings and people just love it. It's just, what are you averaging approximately for per game for attendance?
Well, we seat 7,210, and we're averaging 8,250.
Wow, isn't that something?
That's pretty good.
My old man knew something, and these people come around, and you can see them, the look of disgust on their face. You have drag queens dragging the infield. I'm like, we do other family stuff. Let's not get all.
Mike, do you schedule your games around the Twins' schedule?
No, we don't. You know what we do? This is really fun. You ask this question. I know you don't know this. The thing I'm most proud about the St. Paul Saints is, you know what we schedule our games around? The high school tournament. We did it in 93, and we do it in 2018. The high school tournament comes into CHS, and they play for 10 days, and we're on the road. And you know why we do that? Because it's the right thing to do. Because it's what a professional team should do to earn its bones to be in that community. And that's what professional teams don't remember. They come in, they push everybody around, they're arrogant, they act, without decorum. But that's the thing I'm most proud of. For 27 years, we've been leaving town so that the high school students can play on a surface like that. And before that at Midway. And that's, I believe, underneath it all, that's why the Saints have been fortunate and been successful, because we know our place in the community. We know our place in the food chain. Everybody says to me, hey, this is great. It must be good for you. The Twins aren't playing well. It's terrible for us. Why? Because the Vikings take over August 10th, take over all the media, and if the Twins aren't in the race, baseball drops down and people talk about the Vikings. I need the Twins to do well to keep baseball on the, on top of mind. So it's the reverse of what people think. I don't cheer when the Twins are going bad, except when McPhail was running them. I must admit, I outdrew him a couple times, and I reminded him of that.
Listen to those names, McPhail, Veeck. I mean, it is a incestuous game. You must.
Yeah, it is. But then, there's also an instance. One of my closest friends and one of the guys I'm really proud of is a fellow named Dombrowski, who was a west side of Chicago kid. And he walked into my office one day and he said, I gotta get into baseball. And I looked at him and I said, do you drink? And he goes, not much. I go, you always dress this nicely? He goes, always. And I said, you won't fit in very well here with the White Sox, but I think I better hire you. And of course, now he's, running the Red Sox after running the Expos and running the Marlins. And that was another thing my old man taught me was he said, never trust yes men. Always hire people who disagree with you. And Dombrowski and I, God, we couldn't be more different, which is fortunate for him, not so fortunate for me. But the fact is that, we've never agreed on anything in 45 years of being friends. But it makes for a great, I worked for him in Detroit for 3.5 years, and I had more fun. And I've seen Dave at the top of his game. I've seen him, how well he behaves when things aren't going as well as they are today in Boston. So, I hire people that aren't like you, stay out of their way, don't micromanage. And when they're doing a good job, mention that to them.
Mike, I wanted to ask you something about your promotions that you did. The one I've done a little research on it. I know one I thought was classic when you call it, I think, the judge and jury. You had somebody dressed up as a judge, and you had him standing behind a pitching mound calling balls and strikes, and then you had a bunch of little leaguers or something. They were calling the plays at the bases. I thought that was really a genius. But do those promotional ideas, do they come out of your background, or do you have a promotions director, or where does that all come from?
Well, originally, when you're making your bones, those were mine. So for 25 years, you consult, you ask people, you do things like that, And now I'm happy to say I have one of the best promo guys in the country, a woman by the name of Sierra Bailey, who is better than I will ever have thought of being. And she's just terrific, and we're very democratic. You know, everybody talks today about inclusion. Hey, we got to have inclusion. You know how you have inclusion? You walk around and ask people what they think. And then they turn around and tell you what they think, and they feel part of it. And the one you're mentioning, you know, with Alan Page as the judge and the support group around him, that was a gift to me from Major League Baseball, because naturally they put the dagger in. But I contacted Fox Sports, and I said, I want to have a game without umpires. And they said, we can do that. You know, the technology exists. And I said, I was certain that you could do it with lasers. So let's call balls and strikes, you know, with an inanimate object and artificial intelligence, or whatever they're calling it today. And Fox was very excited. They were going to bring all of this very sophisticated equipment to Midway Stadium and do a game for the lowly St. Paul Saints to try the technology out. Major League Baseball got wind of this, and they called Fox, and amazingly enough, the next day Fox canceled. They said, we really don't have the technology. I said, really? You don't really have the testicular fortitude is what you don't really have. I know what they did to you. And don't give me this thing about, you know, you don't have the technology. It was the same thing when we were all lined up. The Saints were lined up to tour Cuba. We've toured Japan several times, and we were going to Cuba. We'd had all the arrangements, and at the last minute, we couldn't get visas, but the Orioles ended up in Cuba on a goodwill tour, I think they called it. It was goodwill to everybody but the Saints. So it's been wonderful. Dad would love how annoying we've been to the powers that be.
Hey, Mike, let me sneak one in here. How would your dad adjust to this free agency era that we have going right now?
You know, my dad was nothing if he wasn't pragmatic. And he, you know, what really killed my old man was when he testified on behalf of Curt Flood when he challenged the reserve clause. Because Dad saw that this was coming. He knew it was coming. The day we bought the White Sox, the McNally and Messersmith case was handed down. And he knew that you weren't going to maintain the rights to these players. So his attitude was, let's pool all the TV money. Let's have all of the money in a big pot, because you're only as good as your weakest link. Well, Dan Topping and Del Webb, they weren't about to share their TV revenues with the St. Louis Browns, you know, and so he wanted to put all of the TV revenues, just the TV revenues. Everybody else kept all of their, you know, respective revenue streams, and they didn't want to do that. And then he immediately went to Brookings Institute and said, hey, let's figure out a la sabermetrics. Let's figure out benchmarks. So you hit 22 home runs. I'll never forget, we're sitting watching a ball game one day on the eastern shore of Maryland. Except for Jimmy Fox, it's not really a hotbed. And my old man's sitting there, and he looks at me, and he said, who's that kid over there? I said, oh, that's Harold Baines. He goes, that kid can hit. Look at those wrists. I'm like, look at me, Dad. I can pitch. He goes, yeah, you're going to be a phenom until high school, and then they're going to tattoo you. I said, that's a little tough. And that was the moment. But he said to me, and I'm telling you, you know, Ron and I kind of know each other. He said to me, Harold Baines is going to be very durable because of his body type. The way he rolls those wrists over, he's going to hit 18 to 20 home runs, consistently driving 80 runs. But the best thing about it is he's going to do it over 20 years, and that's exactly what happened. And so Dad said if Harold Baines hits 25 home runs, he gets an additional X number of dollars. If he drives in 90 runs, so the incentives are there. And, you know, of course, that by that time, the agents didn't want, you can't take 10% on the come, or in some cases 20%. So, you know, But he'd be very pragmatic. He'd say, right now, let's use Sabre for what they should be, which is provide information. You know, I think we were talking last night. Can you imagine? Red Shaindiest had the greatest quote in the history of the world when he was managing Bob Gibson. And somebody said, Red, how do you take Bob Gibson out of a game? Could you imagine going out to the mound and going, Bob, you've thrown 100 pitches. We think you ought to. You know, I mean, he'd have taken a flamethrower out and murdered you. So somebody said to Shaindiest, how do you take Gibson out of a game? He said, carefully.
Yeah, Mike, one of your dad's greatest quotes, I use it all the time, was that when free agency came in, he said it's not going to be the high cost of stardom. It's going to be the high cost of mediocrity. And he was so right on with that.
Yeah, he was.
Didn't realize that was a Bill Veeck quote.
Yeah, I said that. Yeah, it was a Bill Veeck quote. Yeah.
Yeah.
I use that all the time when they signed stiffs like Jeff Samardzija with the Giants for $65 million for 4 years when he can't win a game. He couldn't win a game before that. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, he could see around. Of course, I was not above torturing him on occasion with some of his own words came back like any father and son to haunt him, and I reminded him that his first free agent sign was Ron Blumberg, and I can't remember the amounts, but I remember that he hit 8 home runs, and I guarantee that he was a lot more expensive to us than those 8 home runs.
Oh, this is so much.
Mike, can we talk about those 2 terrific books that Ed Lynn and your dad co-authored? You briefly mentioned that you thought The Hustler's Handbook, as do I and Al Blumkin, was a better book. Did your dad write most of it and Ed Lynn help, or was it the other way around?
Well, there was a combination. The first book was pure Veeck. It was Dad just wrote it all out, you know, typed it out with his 2-finger pecking.
The book was fantastic.
And then, of course, Ed Lynn shaped it, edited it, you know, moved huge portions from this chapter to that chapter and applied the finesse because Dad was dying, and the doctors had said, you know, we don't know how long you have to live, but we do know that you have a golf ball-sized tumor in your brain, and it's going to kill you. And so he was working as quickly as he could because that was going to be his legacy for, you know, he had 9 children, and Mary Frances, who is at 97, still with us, and so he was a man on a mission. So the second one, they really found their rhythm. And so Dad would do a chapter and Ed would follow that up with a chapter, and then they'd get together and drink beer all night and argue about the structure of it. But Veeck and Rec named names and was interested. I mean, he was threatened to be sued 30, 40 times over Veeck as in Rec. And of course it was Ed who absolutely studiously, you know, researched it, and no one ever filed a suit because it was accurate. I had Calvin Griffith come out and throw out the first pitch in '93, and by then he'd become avuncular. Well, I don't know how Calvin ever got to be avuncular. I don't think of him as avuncular, but he came up to me in the airport and he goes, it's Veeck with the Saints, huh? You guys are kind of upstart. He goes, I never forgave your old man for calling me stupid. I said, well, I never forgave him for calling me stupid either. So don't take it personally. But the second book is a textbook on how to operate a club, and that's why I found it more entertaining. And if you read it today, and I'm certainly not, suggesting I sound like my father's son in this one. But the truth is, if you read The Hustler's Handbook today, it holds up really well. It's funny, it's direct, And, it's kind of a primer. I mean, they love to rip me, and Sid Hartman would always say, you're just doing what your father taught you to do. And I go, yeah, that's right. That's right. What kid who had the advantage of being raised by somebody wouldn't he? It's the way I feel connected to him, and he would love this St. Paul. Plus, he tried to stir up when he had the minor league Brewers. He tried to stir up a real rivalry by starting a fist fight in the stands. Hell, I didn't have to do that. I just had to, do a couple interviews, talk about how I couldn't stand Doug Simonek from Fargo, and the Winnipeg owner should, pronounce his name the way it really was written. And we had battles, so life's good.
Hey, Mike, tell us some of the funny things that you've done for different entertainment throughout the baseball. I mean, you were telling us that I was at a breakfast meeting where you spoke, and it was so entertaining. Tell us a few stories.
Thank you. In a few years ago, I decided that we would be really democratic, and so I asked everyone
and my phone is dying.
What the greatest promotion would be, and 3 women in Charleston said we should give away a vasectomy. And I said, and when would you like to do that? And they said, well, Father's Day, you moron. And I said, okay. That makes me mildly nervous. And they go, it'll be a gas. Well, we announced at 2:00 that we were going to give away a vasectomy, and at 2:20, the Archdiocese was picketing. At 2:40, the Mayor Riley, called and said, Michael, I'm going to have to cancel my season tickets with you all. I just can't abide by this vasectomy giveaway. And at 3:00, the interim commissioner, Bud Selig, called. I think Mike Moore was the president then, and said, what's that idiot in Charleston doing? And tell him that we're going to fine him out of the great state of South Carolina if this persists. And so at 3:20, I canceled the promotion. And so it had a shelf life of 80 minutes. But I did put it on the wire because I thought it would be kind of funny that everybody was so out of whack over this. And I'm Catholic, so I couldn't, the diocese and all this canceling was like, I'm like, God, you talk about running for the hills. So, everybody picks it up. And in Anchorage, Alaska, which is a long way away from Charleston, the headline the next day or a day later was promotion snipped. And we got more coverage. We got more coverage from a promotion that never happened. And then they called my mother, who was the first publicist, the first female publicist for the Ice Show. I mean, she cut deals in back rooms when guys were smoking cigars and, and having brandy before 10:00 in the morning. And they called my mother and they go, Mary Frances, you were married to Bill and he did some really outlandish things. What do you think about your kid giving away a vasectomy? And my mother waited a moment, knew I was on fire with this thing, and told the Kansas City Star, have you ever met my son? It might have been a good idea in his case, and I got 3 more days of heavenly coverage. I mean, and, the serious thing about it was I grew up in a house where it wasn't a disaster if you failed. This whole thing about, people tell us all the time, when we're coming up or now we're telling our kids or our grandkids, hey, it's okay to fail. Nobody wants to fail. I didn't want to have Disco Demolition turn out the way it did, but I sure wanted 100,000 people to show up at the corner of 35th and Shields because we had bottled something. That was an event. You take chances. And nowadays, everybody's so worried. Gee, I can't upset the executive vice president in charge of never having an idea. I better not do this. And we're a fun factory. We take chances. I would like to play a game next year, an exhibition game, and have 3 balls and 2 strikes. and see what it does to the time on the game. And we're an experimental league. Do you think the world's going to stop? The purists are going, what a terrible thing. Really? Why? We try it. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, hey, who cares? It's an exhibition game.
Mike, can we get off the humorous subject a second and talk about your dad's experiences in World War II and how that shaped the rest of his life?
He never talked about it. He never spoke about it. He was very proud, inordinately proud of being a 4-time PFC in the Marine Corps. He once took a test. They said he was perfect for a radio guy. He simply worked out a pattern on the test and colored in all the dots. And he was more surprised than anyone when he scored 94% or something on the hearing test. But he went to the islands. He was 30 years old. He enlisted. And I asked him once how it felt to have lost his leg there. And he said, you never forget dragging yourself through the latrine. And that taught me a great deal about his humanity and about his character. And he never complained. I never heard my old man through 37 operations as they hacked more and more of his leg away. You know, he had jungle rot in not one but both ears, and I never heard him complain one time, ever. Wow. He would get these sores on his stump, you know, back when the prostheses weren't as advanced as they were today. And, you know, he would take the stump sock off and sit on the couch, and we'd be watching a ball game and having a beer. And I'd look at these welts and I'd think, man, that's really unpleasant looking. But I would never say that, and he never did say it either. And I learned to really admire that. He used to love this. One of my favorite quotes of his is, suffering is overrated.
That's a great one.
Oh, that's
I'm
fabulous.
just guessing that your mom ran the roost around the household. Am I correct?
Yeah, my old man didn't know how to do anything. He learned to open a can of beer, but he had 9 kids, so that we were like a human conveyor belt. And Mom was sick. Mom was sick for about 6 weeks, and after 4 days of not eating, my sister said to my dad, Dad, there's a thing called takeout. You could call this restaurant and then drive in and pick up pizza. And Dad was just, he if he didn't eat at home, he ate at the ballpark. But the fact that there were other places was just astounding to him. So my sister Maria, who was kind of take charge, she called my grandmother and she scooted on up, and that worked. But he was a wonderful father. It was like being raised by Geppetto, the toy maker. But there were blind spots. You know, he didn't realize that you really had to go to school, and, you know, he didn't know why. He kind of vaguely knew that he was very proud of his kids who all went to college. But, you know, he was a magical man. He was a fine, fun father. And I don't think people always say to me, hey, he was a great baseball guy. And I go, he was a better father. And what else can you say?
Right.
Well, I'll tell you what exemplified his life was that, as far as I know, the man was absolutely colorblind.
Yeah, he just didn't have time for it, and I'm sure there's a great story, not apocryphal, because this is one story he would tell me late at night, and we would have these conversations, and he said to me, you know, when I was a little boy, my daddy called me into the ticket office at Wrigley Field, and I was about 10 or 11, and my daddy, he would say, told me to take the tills, you know, and the registers, and empty all the money in the middle of the counting table. So I did. I went to each window and I emptied all the registers and the tills in the middle of the table. And my grandfather, his dad, looked at him and said, Bill, what's the color of that money? And my dad, and he was such a great storyteller. So I'm not doing it justice, but he'd look at the money, and he'd look at my grandfather, and he'd look at the money. Finally, he said to his dad, he said, "Dad, that money's green." And my grandfather said, "That's very good, William. What's the color of the person who put that money in your till?" And my father looked at the table and looked at the money and looked at my grandfather's face, searching. He looked back at the money, and finally he said, "I don't know." And my grandfather said, "And never forget that."
That's right. That's
It was
great.
a pretty simple, and to him it was, I must have been like 14 before I realized that Larry Doby's children weren't my brothers and sisters. And I never thought anything about it. We lived on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and one day Veeck and Doby were having a couple of beers. They thought it'd be funny if we jumped into the country club pool all together. Well, Maryland wanted to be deep south, and when these white kids and black kids jumped into the pool holding hands, they didn't think that was so cool. I don't think they drained the pool, but I can tell you they got us out of there in a hurry. And we went back, and Doby and Veeck were just laughing, Your
dad wanted to integrate baseball back in the 30s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, 1942. In 1942, he wanted to buy the Phillies. And Kennesaw, Mountain Landis, and some of the other fellas engineered a sale for less money to the Philadelphia. I'm trying to think of the Phillies. Cox owned the Phillies cigar. The Philadelphia Ball Club.
Oh, is it Phillies?
The sponsor was Phillies Cigar, and Cox owned them, and so they engineered the sale to Cox. And it's not to take anything away. The only history is what happened. And Branch Rickey went on, but Bill had an idea or two about, because during the war, all the talent was depleted, and he looked over because the first Negro League All-Star game was played at Comiskey Park, as you would imagine, and he got a chance to see Cool Papa Bell and Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson, and he said, "I know how we can, keep the caliber of baseball high is by signing some of these guys." He really didn't care. He was the least judgmental man I ever met, and that's, as you get older, you realize how difficult that is to continue to be non-judgmental. And he just came naturally to him.
I ask this to people about, it doesn't have to be Bill Veeck, all of our parents and grandparents. How would they, if they were alive today, brought back today, what would their reaction be to the state of the world today?
Well, I'm gonna back into answering that. When people come to a Saints game, the thing that Major League Baseball is not aware of is that people come to a Saints game to escape their mortgage payment, to escape their realities of their life that are sometimes difficult. And for 3 hours, you're a caretaker, which is why we make it fun, which is why I believe we've been successful. And my father used to always say, signing Larry Doby was his politics. Signing Satchel Paige, which really stuck in the sporting news proprietors' craw, and of course he hid behind Satchel's age. He said he's making, a travesty of the game, and Taylor Spink just couldn't get over that. But what he was really doing was, it was code. It was racist. It was, call it what you will. For the first time, I think my dad would not have been able to contain himself. I think he would have violated his own rule, which is baseball is apolitical. They come to us to escape. They don't come to us for us to preach. We signed the first woman to play in modern times, Isla Borders. We had the first blind announcer. We signed a paraplegic to work, and indeed we have, people who have disabilities all over the ballpark working. Those are our politics. But I think, he might have popped off.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. It's great.
He might not have been adverse to a lot of the things that, for instance, the experiments that you're making with rule changes and what have you. Which rule changes would he have been dead set against? Which innovations of today, which changes would have really stuck in his craw?
Well, the DH, there's no question. The DH is annoying for several reasons. It's it's an extra salary that you're carrying, really, if you're honest about it. And so I think you need the American and National League consistently doing what they do. He would be very much in favor of the 20-second clock, which indeed he installed. He installed that because Camilio Pasquale used to make him crazy. Camilio Pasquale could go on a 2-week family vacation between pitches. And I remember my old man, he'd be insane. Throw the ball, Camilio, he'd say. Throw the ball. And so they installed the pitchometer in the exploding scoreboard in Comiskey. And basically you have 20 seconds from when the ball comes back. And then a buzzer went off. And it went off once, and Ed Hurley, the old umpire, had a conniption, and that was it. He had an eye in the sky, which was basically an instant replay, except it was set up by the racetrack where they had photo finishes. So he had a camera aimed at first base, and if it was a bad call, there would be pictures of it posted at the gates as people left, so they could see a blown call and things like that. But the number one thing that he would rail against right now is the control that television has, asserted itself in such insidious fashion over the game. They give you this 2 minutes between. They sell commercials. And baseball to them is product. And the television really does wag the dog, and that's unfortunate.
Mike, would your dad be shocked that there are fewer players, African American players, playing in the big leagues today than were not really so because there are 30 teams, but if you know what I'm saying, there is a lower percentage of African Americans than played in, say, the late 50s.
Yeah, but he would be very much, as I said, pragmatic, a man of his time. And in the 70s, when 27% of the talent on the field, were African Americans, and then now it's down to 7 or 8%. Baseball has never made a continued effort to attract minorities and everybody. What we don't need are a bunch of meetings. What we need are just to hire people. And so he would not be surprised, because when you guys when I was growing up, we played sandlot baseball, and there were ballparks in every community, whether you went to, whether you were in St. Andrews Parish, Orrin Rosenthal and I used to play pickup every single day after Orrin's violin lesson, which was really ugly, because as you went through Hyde Park, we learned to be tough, because Orrin took that violin with him everywhere. But once he got down to shortstop, yeah, and we had to fight so we could get to the game. But we played with guys 3, 4, 5 years older, and Orrin was as fluid around shortstop as anybody I've ever seen. Sandlot baseball is the point. And it didn't matter. If you could play, Aubrey Millay was a black kid that played with us. I was a Catholic, not really popular then in Hyde Park. Orrin Rosenthal was Jewish. None of us knew any of that. We just loved one another because we could play this game together. And now, there are no sandlot games because we have to enforce rules constantly. God, we tell kids you can play from 3 to 3:45. And the geography in inner cities and in urban areas has become so valuable. Nobody wants to have a ball diamond. They want to put a condominium up. So it's natural, you know, and the NFL, even though I draw into, you know, I have problems with some of their behaviors. They've marketed their clubs and they've marketed their, you know, one game a week. And I do think that Adam Silver is the greatest commissioner from the NBA in my lifetime. I think Adam Silver, you know, that guy on the West Coast made those comments and Adam Silver threw him out of the league. And I think that's what baseball needs. I don't think we've had that kind of leadership since Bart Giamatti,
Right.
you know,
Right.
ruled for 38 days or whatever it was. But it's geography and it's reaching out and it's hiring. You know, who wants to go into you know, baseball when you don't see any black owners, when you don't see enough black general managers and things, you know, and so it's a natural. We brought this on ourselves, and you know, I hope that Torrey Hunter is going to change a lot of that. I think he's one of the great spokespersons, people, if you will, of all times. He calls a spade a spade. He's right straightforward about it. And I think he's the guy, if I ever sold the Saints, that's who I'd like to sell to.
Wow.
He's terrific. He's terrific.
Mike,
This has been so
you
much
have
fun.
children that are interested in baseball and carrying on the legacy?
Yeah, my son Night Train, who is right now in Chicago with Bill Murray, they went to see Beyonce and Jay-Z last night. I'm sure they're going to a Cub game this afternoon. But Night Train worked with me for 1,000 games, which, to give you an idea, that's 12 seasons. I mean, that's a lot of. And so, and then he went to the White Sox and worked 7.5 years. He took a hiatus and went to Australia on behalf of a cricket league to learn how to run social media from a league standpoint. And he's now back in Chicago, and every 3 days he knocks on the White Sox door. I finally said to Murray, God forbid I said this to you gentlemen. I'm sorry. I said, maybe he should work for the Cubs. It was good enough for my grandfather, but I don't know if he's going to break down. He's just going to keep knocking at Comiskey Park. Oh, they don't call it that. It's Guaranteed Rate Field. What is that about? I got to go. I can't. You'll never get me off if I start on Guaranteed Rate Loan Field, whatever it is. So, but yeah, I think he's going to be better than I ever thought he'd be. And what else does a father want to say about his kid?
Nice.
Great.
Nice.
That's
That
great.
really
That's
sounds
great.
good on the show, because all we talk about basically is getting baseball back to attracting the children for the next generation. And that's one reason I'm proud that Ronnie Rabinovitz, who carries on the legacy of his boyhood friend, Jackie Robinson. He was a boy. Jackie was an adult. But anything to keep the game alive and interesting for future generations. That's what it's about.
And you know what? It's very simple. We make things so much more difficult than they need to be. And I'll close with this. I know what you're thinking. Oh my God, he's going to get up on the soapbox. God save us. But I've really enjoyed this, and I actually want to attempt to say something factual, so I know that will amaze you. But Bill Murray, if you come to a Saints game, Bill Murray is arguably one of the 10 or 20 most famous visages in the world. I mean, he's a recognizable and has been for 40 years. Are you with me on that? I'm right? I mean,
for sure.
Well, when you come to CHS, you just walk up to him and go, Bill, I'd love to have a picture or an autograph. And he is so gracious and has been so gracious in the 30-plus years we've been partners. So I'm not talking about, this is not a recent development. Now, if your listeners go out today and try to get an autograph from Joe Mauer, and especially if you're a 7-year-old girl and that's what you've been living for, You've been saving your money to come to this game, to get an autograph from Joe. You can't get near him. So what is the point? The point is that what Major League Baseball needs to do is dictate to the players that they be accessible for their fans. And that means
absolutely
you don't hide in the clubhouse because you have a groin pull. You know, I've seen Murray out there sign autographs when the critics have ravaged a piece of his work. And he probably doesn't really feel like being out there. But he is, because he's a gamer. And that's what the commissioner needs to do, is to issue an edict and say, every player on every squad needs to spend a half an hour out at the railings, and the clubs don't shag the kids out of the good seats. And that's what this team, I mean, that's what we need. That's what the game needs to go on. Because we're losing those 7 and 8 year olds who are on their phones all the time because our heroes aren't accessible.
Right. Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
I got to go. Thanks.
Hey, Mike, what a terrific
Mike, thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
Very enjoyable for me too, Mike. And I'm a baseball traditionalist, so I'm listening to what you're saying. I'm agreeing with it 100%. That's the way I feel, and these guys, Ronnie and Ralph, know that, and Alan, and I really enjoyed having you on with us.
Well, thanks. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, buddy.
We'll
be in touch.
See you. Bye.
Okay.
We've had Mike Veeck, son of Bill, and father of Night Train. So it goes down from generation to generation, and this was terrific. Ron, thank you for bringing Mr. Veeck. And
he's an amazing guy.
Al Blumkin, thank you for being here.
He had to be. He said his phone was dying, so he had to.
Yes. Okay. And George Case, thank you.
Hey, my pleasure. It was very enjoyable for me.
Okay,
yeah, it
gentlemen,
was a great show.
Let's do it next week. How about that?
Okay.
Yep. Talk to you then.
Everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a wonderful
Bye-bye.
day. The show is In Case You're Wondering with George Case. I'm Ralph Tyko, the weak link of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Adios, everybody.